Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Astrid Medina Gesha Wash Process Colombia from Flower Child Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Flower Child, based out of Oakland, California. And this is their second ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed their Faverninco, one of my favorite Colombian coffees we've reviewed this year. So I definitely wanted to go back and review another one of their coffees when we had the opportunity. And this coffee caught my interest for a couple of reasons, the first of which being that it very much sounds like my type of coffee, but the second reason being that this is Flower Child's first ever high-end offering, so I was definitely curious to see how this coffee would turn out, as this right here is day 41. And recipe we went with for this coffee was similar to our Say recipe, which was at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. But with this coffee, we went a little finer with it as well. Now, roast profile for this coffee, Flower Child does roast on the lighter side of things relative to a lot of American coffee roasters. And I do have to say that this is the lightest coffee I have ever had from Flower Child. At times, it reminded me of some really light coffees that we've had from Manhattan. Maybe it's not to that level of lightness, but it is still a very light coffee by a lot of standards and metrics. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and ran it through the V60, and as mentioned, the first note I took away from this coffee was that it was surprisingly lighter than expected, as there was an immediate grainy quality to the cup right from the onset. Perhaps a bit early to be drinking this one, as the only thing I was really able to pick up was a little bit of an undefined brightness, as well as some subtle florals and a citric dominant cup. So not necessarily the best first impression. I honestly felt that a lot of rest would do this coffee some good. Day 18, ran it through the Chemex, and once again, the second impression felt that this coffee still needed a little bit more time. There's a slightly deep, dark sweetness in the finish, but for the most part, it continues to remain moderately light and tame at the forefront, with that dark berry sweetness on the back end being perhaps the most dominant aspect of this cup, but that's on a relative scale, as the majority of this coffee wasn't necessarily the most vibrant at this time. Day 21, ran it through the April dripper, and this is the best day I experienced from this coffee, as it was a bit more of the subtle dark berries at the forefront of this one, with a complementary florality to it. It feels like there was a strong lack of definition and more rest was needed, but I was starting to see a bit of improvement with just a little bit more time. And I think that's the biggest takeaway I had, was that it didn't necessarily mean that this brewer was better, but rather that time was just helping this coffee improve in general. Day 24, back through the V60 with higher temperatures, and the coffee seems to have benefited from the time, as I definitely felt a little bit more of a long-lasting fruit brightness from the cup. In addition to that, there was plenty of the dark florals as well as berry sweetness at the forefront. For the most part though, it continues to remain moderately tame, with a overall vibrancy increasing ever so slightly. It does feel like it's headed in a positive direction, but at the same time, I was still experiencing a fair bit of that grainy citric quality. Day 27, ran it through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it continued to remain a little bit more on the moderate and tame side. So for that reason, I opted to stick with the V60 going forward. I was just getting a little bit more vibrancy out of the cup from that brew method. It does have more of those subtle aspects, the dark berries, yet again, some slight florality in the cup, and a bit of a lingering soft citric finish to the cup. Once again, all of these things were very subtle. For the most part, it just remained a little bit more bright without a very defined profile to it. Day 30. Back through the V60, and the cup feels like it's finally starting to open up a little bit, as there is a honey sweet aspect on the first sip, but cools nicely into much more of this darker, complex berry sweetness, and for that reason, it's the most enjoyable day I had of this coffee, at least up to this point. Finishes with more of that slightly grainy citric quality, very much in line with Gesha-like experiences, so significantly better. It is worth noting that this is when I made the tasting wheel, because that's going to play a huge role in the tasting wheel. Day 33, another day that was not quite as good. It came out to be a little bit inconsistent in this coffee, as I stuck to the same adjustments we had made previously. And on this day, it was a little bit more herbal and grainy all around, as there was a fair bit of those darker fruit aspects in a much more subtle sense this time. Possibly a little sensitive to the brew, and that's one takeaway I had from this day, and probably the biggest takeaway I had from this day, is that this coffee can be very sensitive to you brewing it, but even then, for the majority of the time consuming this coffee, it was not necessarily the most vibrant. Day 37, a better day of the coffee as it continues to remain a little bit more inconsistent. Plenty of the delicate, darker florals at the forefront with more of a darker and soft berry aspect on the back end. Delicate, tame, Gesha-like. Here on this day 41 mark, it's still very much the same. Not entirely sure what additional adjustments I could have made to maybe increase some of the vibrancy from this one, but for the most part, this is kind of the way I settled on this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. We have a lot of level 4s, so let's go through those real quick, and we'll start with the cleanliness. Level 4, yes, so unsurprisingly, it is a pretty clean cup of coffee. We do have a washed Colombian Gesha, so one would expect it to be a very clean coffee. Even then, it is on the slightly higher side of the level 4, but the main reason it didn't achieve a higher level was because there wasn't too distinct or defined of a definition within this coffee. So for that reason, even though it is a very clean coffee, I couldn't necessarily justify it any higher than that. Finish, level 4. Yes, this one's actually on the lower side of level 4, as this one had such a very tame and moderate finish that for the majority of the time drinking it, I kind of said, okay, it's not necessarily the quickest finish, it's a little bit of this complex kind of darker finish to it, but nothing, once again, overly defined or pronounced. If anything, it was a little bit more of the brightness that was present within the finish. I think one thing they listed was a cherry acidity. I could see that. It is, once again, kind of this darker fruit acidity within this coffee, so that works for me in that sense, I suppose. Sweetness, level 4. And this is why I highlighted that day 30 mark, because I mentioned that this coffee was a little inconsistent. And on this day 30 mark, this coffee right here was the sweetest it had been for the entirety of the time I had been consuming this coffee. In fact, usually I make it on the second to last day of the time drinking the coffee, the notes that we're making, but this day I opted to make it on that day, given just how much I was enjoying the coffee on that specific day. So truth be told, this coffee, I made the tasting wheel one more time and I came to a level 3. I would say that for the majority of the time I was drinking this coffee, level 3 is a little bit more fair. I'm just being a little generous with this one. It's on the level 4, but definitely the lower side of the level 4. Acidity, level 4. Yes, it's a very bright coffee. Even then, it's nothing too distinct or unique in that sense. It had a fair bit of acidity. I think a lot of that was expected given the profile of this coffee. Florality, level 4. Yes, this is once again on a relative scale, so this isn't necessarily the most floral forward cup of coffee, but given that everything within this coffee was so delicate and tame to begin with, relative to the other experiences we had, I feel like this is maybe on the lower side of level 4, but once again, nothing in this coffee was too pronounced. That's why the berry fruit as well as the citrus fruit are both at that level 4 mark. I feel like the most distinct thing in terms of like the complexity I was experiencing was this darker fruit aspect. If anything, it reminded me of that Ethiopia from fruit I had a very long time ago, which had this kind of darker foresty berry as I described it. That was present here yet again, but in a very subtle and just kind of secondary sense. And then the citrus fruit, very undefined. It was just a very citric quality to the cup that was in line with the brightness as well. So I don't necessarily think that they were overly pronounced, once again, both on the lower side of level 4, but relative to a lot of the other things in this tasting wheel, I feel like they're much more justified. And then a handful of level 3s. The first one is the body at a level 3. I feel like the first instinct with this being a washed Gesha would be that it shouldn't reach that mark. This one did have a little bit more texture and body than I might have expected. Once again, on the lower side of the level 3 mark, but even then, I feel like it had enough body to justify being higher than that level 2 side of things. And the stone fruit at the level 3, yes, I feel like that's probably the last thing worth discussing in this tasting wheel. And they do have listed a plum, and once again, it had this darker fruit aspect to it, so I could see that being there, but again, it would be on the lower side of level 3. Yet again, I'm going to continue to highlight the fact that this is all on a relative scale, so while it's not necessarily the most pronounced or dominant thing, there was enough of it to justify scoring that mark, given that the base of this coffee was so clean and delicate to begin with. But yeah, I think that's kind of everything worth discussing in this tasting wheel. I feel like it's a pretty good representation of what I was experiencing from this coffee, maybe with the exception of the sweetness. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one definitely felt like a victim of expectations, and I've discussed this coffee with a number of people, and they've all kind of come out to the same conclusion that we probably went into this one with some really high expectations, and I've even heard from people that the owner of this company was talking up this coffee a little bit as they seemed to really enjoy this one, but for whatever reason, I feel like I didn't necessarily get the best out of this coffee, but I also feel like given just how much feedback I've had from this one, this is just kind of the way that this coffee is. It's It's maybe a little bit too tame and delicate for me. And I say this a lot, I do enjoy very tame and delicate coffees, especially if they have some really nice complexity to them. But this one right here may have been just a little bit on the too soft, too delicate, too tame side of things, because it didn't really seem to have a very clear definition for me. It didn't seem to have a very clear focus. For the majority of the time I was drinking this coffee, I was really trying to pull out those extremely subtle notes. And while I at times felt like they were distinct and pronounced enough, they were fleeting as well, so it's not something that I could say was very consistent, as the coffee also remained a little inconsistent while consuming it. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, somebody that does enjoy their much more delicate coffees, as this one offered so many delicate aspects right from the onset. I did kind of mention it had a lot of Gesha-like qualities, most specifically that kind of citric aspect to it, and the florality as well as the berry fruit components were quite soft as well, so maybe just a little bit more on the tame side of things in general, something that doesn't necessarily skew very strong in a lot of directions while still offering some very nice cleanliness and clarity in general. But for the most part, I think that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you enjoyed the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. And this right here has been a review of the Astrid Medina Gesha Wash Process Colombia from Flower Child Coffee. Thank you for watching.